A cold wind rustled the funeral flowers as the priest spoke his final words. The dog, tethered near the coffin, let out a guttural growl, his body trembling. "Why won't he stop?" a man asked. The priest's fingers twitched. "Because he knows the truth." The late autumn wind whispered through the sprawling estate, rustling the golden leaves that blanketed the ground like remnants of a forgotten past. The mansion loomed against the overcast sky, its towering silhouette framed by skeletal trees that had long since shed their warmth. Inside, dust clung to the heavy drapes, the air thick with the scent of aging wood and faded perfume. Thomas Whitmore had built his empire from nothing. A self-made millionaire, he once commanded boardrooms with an iron will, striking deals that turned rivals into footnotes in history. Yet, in death, his grandeur meant nothing. His lifeless body now lay in a sleek mahogany coffin at the center of an opulent funeral parlor, adorned with towering black candles that flickered uneasily. Mourners gathered, draped in sorrow and expensive fabric, their murmurs polite but devoid of true grief. Business partners, old associates, distant relatives, none shed tears. They paid their respects with practiced solemnity, their gazes flicking between the ornate decorations and their watches. At the far end of the chapel, the Whitmore family crest loomed, a gilded insignia embedded into the grand stone wall, its Latin inscription half eroded by time. The weight of the family's legacy hung in the air, suffocating yet hollow, much like the man they had come to bury. Yet amidst the muted wails of the organ, one presence shattered the decorum: a dog. It sat at the edge of the room, a wiry mutt with matted fur, its ribs faintly visible beneath its tawny coat. It was no purebred, no pampered pet that belonged in this world of affluence. Its eyes, dark as river stones, fixated on the coffin, unblinking. Then, without warning, it began to bark. Sharp, insistent, guttural. Heads turned. A woman in a black veil recoiled slightly, her pearl earrings catching the dim light as she leaned toward her husband. "Whose dog is that?" she whispered. No one answered. The dog's tail was stiff, its body rigid as though caught between fear and defiance. It did not lunge, did not cower, only let out a growl that reverberated through the stillness. Near the pulpit, the priest, Father Vincent, paused, his fingers tightening around the scripture in his trembling hands. He was a man accustomed to grief, to final rites and whispered prayers, yet this moment unsettled him in a way he could not explain. Then a man, a stranger to the family, yet present nonetheless, leaned forward and murmured, "Why is it barking?" Father Vincent's grip turned white-knuckled. He did not answer. Because he knew. Because the dog knew. And some truths were never meant to be unearthed. The air inside the chapel grew thick, almost tangible, pressing against the walls like an unseen weight. Outside, the sky remained muted in shades of gray, as if the heavens themselves mourned in silence. But inside, the only true sorrow came not from the mourners, but from the creature at the foot of the coffin, a thin, trembling mutt whose presence had disrupted the carefully curated dignity of the ceremony. Father Vincent tried to steady his breath. He had presided over countless funerals, had seen grief manifest in 100 different ways, but never like this. The dog barked again, more insistent this time, and its desperate wails scraped against the high ceilings like a call from something beyond the grave. From the front row, Margaret Whitmore, the late millionaire's only sister, stiffened in her chair. She had never been particularly sentimental, least of all about animals, but something about this scene unsettled her. Thomas had never owned a dog. He hated them, found them dirty, unpredictable, a nuisance. So why was this one here? The funeral guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing between each other, hoping someone would claim responsibility for the animal. But no one did. It didn't belong to anyone. A younger man, perhaps in his late 30s, cleared his throat and stepped forward. He wasn't dressed in black like the others, but in a charcoal gray suit, the fabric slightly wrinkled from what looked like a long journey. He had no Whitmore features, no cold blue eyes, no sharp aristocratic jawline. He was an outsider. He crouched to meet the dog's gaze, his voice calm but firm. "Easy there, boy." What's got you so worked up?" The dog didn't recoil. It didn't growl at him as it had at the others. Instead, it stopped barking for the first time since the ceremony had begun. But it didn't look away from the coffin. The man's brow furrowed. He turned to Father Vincent and asked again, "Why is it barking?" The priest felt his stomach twist. His mind flickered to something he had sworn to forget, to a secret that was supposed to be buried along with Thomas Whitmore. But now the past refused to stay buried. The guests whispered among themselves, their curiosity growing. The dog, this stranger, the priest's unease, it was a ripple disturbing the stillness of what was meant to be a smooth, controlled farewell. "Perhaps we should remove the animal," Margaret finally said, her voice sharp, almost commanding. But the man ignored her. He rose to his full height and stared at Father Vincent, waiting. And that was when the priest did something he hadn't done in years. He swallowed hard. Then he looked away. And in that moment, the stranger knew. Father Vincent was afraid. A low murmur rippled through the mourners, a sound of hushed confusion and growing unease. The dog had stopped barking, but its presence lingered like an open wound in the pristine setting of the funeral. It did not move from its spot at the base of the coffin, its dark eyes unwavering. Father Vincent, still gripping the edges of his scripture, turned his gaze toward the stranger, the man who had spoken, the one unafraid to ask the question everyone else avoided. The priest's lips parted as if to respond, but instead he took a slow, measured breath, forcing composure back into his trembling hands. Margaret Whitmore stood abruptly, the sharp rustle of her mourning dress slicing through the stillness. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice lined with an edge of barely concealed irritation. "Father, continue the ceremony. Someone, remove this animal." A few men shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, unsure whether they should obey. But the stranger was faster. He reached into his coat pocket, withdrew a small piece of bread, perhaps taken from the reception hall beforehand, and knelt again, extending it toward the dog. "Come here, boy," he said softly, coaxing. The dog's ears twitched. It took a tentative step forward, its nose wrinkling at the offering. But then, just as quickly, it stopped. Its head turned toward the coffin again, the short hairs along its back rising with an unseen tension. The stranger frowned. "You're not hungry, are you?" he murmured. Something was wrong. He straightened, his shoulders squaring, and this time he turned toward the coffin itself. It was an exquisite thing, deep mahogany, polished to a fault, adorned with intricate gold leafing that shimmered beneath the funeral hall's dim lighting. A coffin befitting a man of Thomas Whitmore's status. But as the stranger studied it, a strange thought began to gnaw at him. The dog wasn't barking at the mourners. It wasn't barking at the priest. It was barking at what lay inside. A fresh chill crept through the air, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees. The stranger's skin prickled with unease. Something wasn't right. He took a slow step closer. Father Vincent saw the motion and reacted instantly. "That's quite enough," he interjected, his voice sharper than before, a little too forceful. "This is a sacred ceremony. Please, show some respect." But the stranger wasn't deterred. He had seen enough to know that something about this entire scene was off. He turned to face the priest fully now, taking in the way his fingers still trembled around the edges of his scripture, the way a thin sheen of sweat had begun to form at his temples. This wasn't the composure of a man performing a routine funeral service. This was the tension of a man hiding something. The dog let out another low growl, and for the first time since he had arrived, the stranger spoke with certainty. "What's inside that coffin?" A sharp silence fell over the hall. Margaret scoffed, her expression twisting in offense. "How dare you? Answer the question!" The stranger cut in, his tone even, but firm. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were locked onto the priest, who had paled considerably. Father Vincent opened his mouth, his jaw working as though struggling to form words. A bead of sweat trailed down his brow. He hesitated. Then, as if the weight of the moment had shattered something inside him, the priest exhaled shakily and looked down. He did not answer. And in that second, the stranger knew. He was right to be suspicious. A quiet tension gripped the room. The mourners, once half bored by the formalities of the service, were now fully alert, their gazes shifting uneasily between the priest, the coffin, and the man who had dared to question it. The dog remained eerily still, its ears pricked, its body locked in anticipation. And then, a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, coming from inside the coffin. A sound no one expected, a sound no one should have heard, a sound that should not have been possible. A thump. The sound was subtle, muffled but unmistakable, a single dull thump against the wood. It was gone as quickly as it came, swallowed by the stunned silence of the chapel. No one moved, no one breathed. The air inside the funeral hall seemed to constrict, as if the very walls had closed in, pressing down on the mourners, forcing their hearts into their throats. Then it came again. Thump. Slightly louder this time. The dog, who had been frozen in place, suddenly snarled, the guttural sound twisting through the air like a rippling omen. Its body snapped rigid, its ears pinned so tightly back against its head that it looked almost unnatural. The stranger's breath came shallow and slow, his pulse pounding in his temples. He turned sharply toward Father Vincent, whose expression had transformed into something close to horror. "What the hell was that?" the stranger asked, his voice low but charged. Father Vincent's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came. He staggered backward, his grip tightening around the leather-bound scripture in his trembling hands. Margaret, whose face had gone ghostly pale, let out a dry, brittle laugh. This is absurd," she said, shaking her head, though the shake was barely perceptible. But no one was listening to her. Every pair of eyes was locked on the coffin. The dog growled again, louder this time, its lips peeling back to reveal sharp, yellowed teeth. It did not bark, did not lunge, only stood in that same stiff stance, as if awaiting something terrible. And then, another thump. But this time it was followed by something worse. A scraping sound, a slow, deliberate dragging of something against the inside of the coffin lid. The stranger's stomach twisted. He took an unconscious step forward, as if pulled toward the source of the sound. He could hear someone behind him whispering frantic prayers under their breath. Then, all at once, a sharp, distinct knock rang out from within the coffin. Knock, knock, rhythmic, insistent, as if whoever or whatever was inside was trying to be let out. A collective gasp rippled through the mourners. Someone stifled a sob. Another took an unsteady step backward, nearly tripping over their own feet. The illusion of a routine funeral had shattered. Father Vincent looked as though he might faint. His hand shot out, gripping the podium for balance. "No," he muttered under his breath, barely audible. "No, this isn't happening." But the sound was real. The stranger turned toward Margaret, his gaze dark and demanding. "Open it." Margaret recoiled. "Excuse me?" "Open the coffin," he repeated, louder this time. Her lips parted, but no words came. Then, in a sudden burst of motion, she turned sharply toward Father Vincent. Tell them this is normal, that bodies shift or... Her words faltered when the priest refused to look at her. His silence was answer enough. The truth was spilling out between the cracks of the moment, unraveling, coming apart at the seams. The stranger clenched his jaw, his muscles coiled, his instincts screaming. He needed to know. He took a step toward the coffin, then another. Father Vincent's eyes snapped up, wild with desperation. "Don't touch it," he shouted. But it was too late. The stranger reached out, his fingertips grazing the polished mahogany lid. And then, from deep inside the coffin, a ragged, gasping breath. The breath that came from inside the coffin was hoarse and strained, as if whatever was trapped within had been suffocating, desperately fighting to pull air into its lungs. It sent a shiver through the room, a dreadful realization that what should have been dead was not. The stranger yanked his hand back instinctively, his pulse roaring in his ears. The gasping sound faded for a moment, replaced by a sickening silence, a void that pulsed with unspoken horrors. Then, knock, knock, knock. The knocking returned, more frantic this time, as if the person inside was clawing toward salvation, trying to force their way out. The room erupted into chaos. Women shrieked, men stumbled backward, knocking over chairs, clutching their mouths, their eyes wide with something beyond fear, revulsion. The air thickened with gasps and cries, the chapel doors creaking under the weight of panicked hands shoving against them, trying to flee. But the dog did not move. It stood frozen, staring at the coffin, its breath coming in slow, measured huffs, its body still rigid with an emotion more primal than fear. Dread. Something deep in its animal instincts recognized that whatever was inside that coffin should not be alive. The stranger turned sharply toward Father Vincent, his voice cutting through the hysteria. "Open it." The priest flinched, shaking his head violently. "No, no, no, no." His hands trembled so badly that he dropped his scripture, the leather-bound book hitting the marble floor with a hollow thud. Margaret Whitmore, who had been pale before, now looked like a ghost herself, her carefully composed features crumbling under the weight of something close to terror. "Thomas is dead," she whispered, almost as if trying to convince herself. "We saw his body. He was dead." A new voice broke through the confusion. "Then what the hell is in that coffin?" It was a younger man, perhaps a distant nephew of the Whitmore family. His face was slick with sweat, his pupils blown wide with terror. The stranger stepped forward, bracing himself. He could hear his own heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Something about this wasn't right. It wasn't just fear. It was a warning. But he had no choice. He reached for the coffin's golden latches. Click. The first one unlocked. Father Vincent gasped, lurching forward as if to stop him, but the priest's knees buckled, sending him crashing to the floor. The stranger's fingers found the second latch. Click. The lid of the coffin shifted. A slow, creaking motion, as if the very wood had begun to breathe. The dog whimpered. It let out a single, piercing yelp before bolting backward, scrambling behind the pews, retreating into the shadows. The stranger ignored it. His breath came in short bursts, his hands slick with sweat. And then, with a final push, he opened the coffin. Silence. The world seemed to pause. Inside lay Thomas Whitmore. But something was wrong. His body was there, dressed in the fine tailored suit he had been buried in, his hands folded over his chest in perfect funeral repose. But his skin was untouched by decay. No pale, sunken cheeks, no darkened veins, no signs of rot. He looked as though he had been placed inside yesterday. The stranger felt his stomach tighten. He had seen death before. He knew how the human body should look after days in a coffin. But this wasn't natural. Thomas Whitmore's face was smooth, his lips slightly parted, as if he had been asleep. Then a slow, raspy exhale pushed through his lips. The stranger stumbled back. The corpse was breathing. A horrified gasp rippled through the mourners who had dared to stay, their eyes stretching wide, their hands flying to their mouths. Someone fainted. Another let out a choked sob. Margaret's knees gave out, and she collapsed onto a nearby chair, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. "No, no, no," she whispered. "This isn't real." The stranger turned sharply toward Father Vincent, fury cutting through his fear. "What the hell did you do?" The priest let out a broken, shuddering breath. His eyes, now glistening with something close to shame, darted to the body inside the coffin. His voice cracked. "I tried to stop it. I tried to stop what?" The stranger's pulse roared. The room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls themselves were pressing inward, suffocating him. And then Thomas Whitmore's hand moved. His fingers twitched once, then again, slow, unnatural, as if the body was relearning how to use itself. Then his eyelids fluttered. The stranger didn't breathe. The dog, still hidden behind the pews, let out a long, high-pitched whine. And then, Thomas Whitmore opened his eyes. The stranger took a step backward, his body stiff with horror. The old millionaire's gaze was vacant, not human, not alive. Something else looked out from behind those once intelligent eyes, something cold, something vast. And when he opened his mouth to speak, his voice came out wrong, as if someone else was using his throat. "You should not have done that." A chilling silence settled over the funeral hall, thick and suffocating, as if the very air had become sentient and was holding its breath. No one moved, no one dared. Thomas Whitmore, or whatever had once been Thomas Whitmore, lay in his coffin, his cold, glassy eyes staring upward at the ceiling. His lips had parted, releasing a breath that should have been impossible. The voice that had spilled from him was not his own. It carried a weight, a darkness, as if it had been pulled from the depths of something ancient and waiting. The stranger's entire body tensed, his instincts screaming at him to run. Every fiber of his being knew, this thing in the coffin was not a man. Margaret Whitmore let out a strangled gasp. She had always prided herself on composure, on dignity, but the sight of her brother's corpse moving, speaking, it had shattered every last remnant of her rational mind. She scrambled backward, her gloved hands clutching at the chair behind her for support. Her voice, barely above a whisper, cracked with terror. What? Is this?" Father Vincent shuddered violently, gripping the podium as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. "I tried to stop it," he murmured again, his voice barely audible, his eyes locked on the body in the coffin. The stranger turned on him, rage flickering beneath his fear. "Stop what?" His voice was sharp, demanding. "What the hell did you do?" Father Vincent did not answer, but Thomas, or the thing inside him, did. His head turned, slowly, unnaturally, and he smiled. Not the smile of a man who had once been alive, not the familiar smirk of a wealthy tycoon who had outlived his enemies. This smile was wrong, a grotesque mimicry of something human. A smile made of emptiness. "You are all afraid," the voice rasped, though Thomas's lips barely moved. Margaret's breath hitched. The dog let out another low, pitiful whine from its hiding place behind the pews. The stranger swallowed hard. The way the voice moved through the room, it didn't sound like it was coming from the body alone. It felt as though it was crawling along the walls, slipping through the cracks, spreading. And then Thomas sat up. Margaret screamed. The room erupted into chaos once more. Mourners bolted for the exits, trampling over one another, their carefully maintained mourning attire now twisted with desperation and hysteria. The sound of shoes scraping against marble, chairs crashing over, hands clawing at the chapel doors. It was panic in its purest form. But the doors would not open. A woman threw herself against them, pounding her fists. "They're locked! They won't—" Slam. Something invisible slammed against the wood from the outside. The mourners stumbled back, eyes widening in horror. Something was keeping them inside. The stranger's breath came fast, sharp. His gaze snapped back to the coffin, to Thomas. He was staring at him. And then, in a voice like fractured stone, he spoke again. "You should have let me sleep." The stranger's blood turned to ice. The doors slammed shut with a force that sent a deafening boom reverberating through the funeral hall. The woman who had been clawing at the handles stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her wide eyes flickered with disbelief as she twisted the knob desperately, her knuckles whitening from the force, but it would not budge. A heavy, suffocating silence followed. Then the lights flickered. A murmur of dread spread through the remaining guests as the overhead chandeliers dimmed, casting long, warped shadows against the marble floor. The candles surrounding the coffin guttered in their glass cases, the flames stretching unnaturally tall before withering into a frail, flickering glow. And still, Thomas Whitmore sat up. His body moved in slow, jerky motions, like a puppet being reeled in by unseen strings. The pristine black suit he had been dressed in crinkled at the shoulders, the fabric straining against unnatural movement. His skin, pale, eerily untouched by death, stretched over sharp, prominent bones, giving him the unsettling look of something caught between decay and preservation. The dog whimpered. And then he turned his head. not with the slow, natural grace of a man waking from a deep sleep, but with a sudden, sharp jerk. Too fast, too precise. His gaze landed on the stranger, and he smiled. A shudder ran through the room, as if the very air had become colder, heavier, denser. The stranger's stomach twisted into knots. Every inch of his body screamed at him to run, to turn away, to do anything but look into those eyes. But he couldn't, because Thomas's eyes, they weren't his. They were wrong. A murky, unfathomable blackness had swallowed them whole, two voids where irises and pupils should have been. Yet somehow they still saw, still watched, still knew. "You should have let me sleep." The voice came again, and this time it was closer, deeper. It didn't just sound wrong, it felt wrong. It coiled through the air like an invisible hand, pressing against the chests of the mourners, wrapping cold fingers around their throats. It crawled beneath the skin, embedding itself in the spaces between reality and nightmare. Someone behind the stranger screamed. Margaret Whitmore stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth as her breath came in rapid, shallow gasps. Her pearl necklace glistened against her throat, rising and falling with each tremor of fear. "No, no, no," she whispered. This isn't happening. This isn't—" Thump. Something struck the coffin from the inside, but Thomas was already out. So what the hell was still inside? The thought sent a ripple of nausea through the stranger. He turned back to the coffin, his breath caught somewhere between his ribs, his heartbeat hammering against his sternum. And then, a hand, a pale, rotting hand, slipped out from beneath Thomas's discarded body. The fingers, blackened at the tips, curled against the velvet lining of the coffin like a spider's legs unfurling after centuries of dormancy. And then another hand, and another. From the depths of the coffin, something else began to rise. The stranger's breath turned to ice in his lungs. Thomas had been dead for days, that much was certain. The funeral preparations had been made. His body had been dressed, embalmed, placed inside this very coffin. And yet, there was more than one thing inside it. A soft, sickly crackle filled the air, a sound like bones snapping back into place. Thomas's lifeless body, now sitting upright, twitched as if something was still using it. And then it spoke again. "You shouldn't have come back." The stranger didn't realize he had stopped breathing. The voice was wrong, not just inhuman, unearthly. It carried echoes, as though multiple voices were speaking at once, layered upon one another, whispering in languages that had no names. Margaret screamed. The mourners, still trapped inside, panicked. Some collapsed into the pews, praying desperately, their hands trembling against rosary beads that had long lost their meaning. Others beat against the doors in frantic desperation, their fists leaving red marks against the aged wood. But nothing opened. The chapel had become a tomb. Father Vincent, his face ashen, fell to his knees beside the pulpit, clutching the cross that hung from his neck. His lips moved silently in prayer, but the words held no power here. The stranger's fingers clenched into tight fists. His pulse was erratic, his vision tunneling in and out of focus. He had seen many things in his life, but never this. Never something that made his soul feel like it was unraveling, one thread at a time. And yet, he stepped forward. He didn't know why. His body acted on instinct. The dog, still crouched behind the pews, let out a pitiful whimper. Its body trembled violently, its head lowering, ears pinned flat against its skull. It knew that whatever had taken residence inside Thomas Whitmore's body was not of this world. And then, Thomas moved. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes locking onto the stranger's with something between curiosity and hunger. And he smiled again. The stranger had to act. He reached into his coat, his fingers brushing against the cold steel of the object he carried. A weapon. He didn't know if it would work, didn't know if this thing could even be killed. But he knew one thing for certain. He would not die here. Not like this. Not in a chapel that had been sealed in darkness. His grip tightened. And then, Thomas Whitmore lunged. Thomas Whitmore lunged. The movement was unnatural, not the panicked thrashing of a man waking from a coma, nor the sluggish unsteadiness of someone recovering from the brink of death. No, this was something else. His body twisted forward like a marionette, his limbs jerking as if they were being pulled by unseen hands. His spine arched unnaturally, his arms splaying out too wide, too fast. His mouth hung open, not in a scream, not in shock, but in hunger. The stranger reacted instinctively. He dove to the side. The force of Thomas's body slammed into the place where he had been standing only seconds before, crashing into the coffin, which splintered under the impact. A horrid, wet, cracking sound filled the air as Thomas's body hit the ground, limbs bending at grotesque angles, his neck snapping back as though it had been struck by an invisible blow. But he didn't stop moving. Even as his body lay twisted, even as his limbs should have been broken, he began to crawl. A ripple of pure terror surged through the funeral hall. Margaret let out a piercing scream, her eyes wild with horror, her shaking hands covering her mouth. The remaining mourners who hadn't fled were now paralyzed with fear, pressed against the walls, their bodies trembling like leaves in the wind. Father Vincent, his breathing ragged, gripped his cross so tightly his knuckles turned white. "This is wrong," he gasped. "This is all wrong." The stranger's heart thundered in his chest. He gritted his teeth, pulling himself upright, his mind racing. He needed to end this. He reached inside his coat, fingers curling around the weapon at his waist. The cold steel of the gun was a familiar weight, something real in the midst of all this madness. He aimed it at the thing that had once been Thomas Whitmore. "Stay down." His voice was low, firm. Thomas laughed. The sound slithered through the room, dripping with something unnatural, something that wasn't human. The stranger's skin crawled. Thomas's head twitched, snapping upright. His soulless black eyes locked onto the stranger, and in a voice that was layered, distorted, crawling with echoes of something deep and ancient, he spoke. "Do you think your little weapon will save you?" The stranger didn't hesitate. He fired. The gunshot roared through the chapel, the explosion of sound ricocheting off the walls like thunder. The bullet hit Thomas directly in the chest. For a moment, everything stilled. Then, Thomas laughed again, a slow, guttural chuckle that sent ice through the stranger's veins. He looked down at the wound, a hole torn through the fine black fabric of his suit, blood seeping through the pristine silk. But he didn't fall, didn't flinch, didn't bleed the way a man should. Instead, the wound began to close. The stranger's grip tightened on the gun. His breath came sharp and fast, adrenaline pumping through his veins, his body preparing for the only thing left to do, run. Thomas tilted his head, his eerie grin widening. "Do you understand now?" he whispered. The stranger's stomach dropped. This thing, it wasn't Thomas Whitmore anymore. It was wearing him. A sick, vile mimicry of the man he had once been. The dog behind the pews let out a single, long, soul-deep howl. And then, the lights died. Darkness swallowed the chapel whole. The screams began instantly. Mourners cried out, their voices jagged with terror. Some tripped, crashing over pews in their desperate attempts to find an exit. Others stood frozen, too afraid to move. The stranger spun, his pulse hammering, his eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden blackness. The only light now came from the faint, flickering glow of the few remaining candles, their flames weak and guttering, barely pushing against the overwhelming darkness. And then, the whispering began. Not one voice, not two, hundreds. Soft, murmuring hisses that slithered through the air, creeping into the ears of the remaining guests, filling every corner of the room. The whispers came from everywhere, and from nowhere. The stranger's chest tightened. He turned sharply, his instinct screaming, his every nerve on fire. And then something cold brushed against his skin. Fingers, hands, something reaching for him from the darkness. He jerked back just as a shape lunged out of the shadows. A blur of movement, teeth flashing, a face that was no longer human. Thomas. The stranger fired again, blindly. The shot split through the darkness, the muzzle flash illuminating the nightmare for just a fraction of a second. And in that second, he saw. Not just Thomas, not just his twisted, unnatural body, but others. Shapes moving behind him. Too many, too wrong. Things that had never been human. The whispering rose. The stranger ran. He didn't think, just moved. His boots pounded against the marble floor as he sprinted for the doors, his breath ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs. The whispers chased him. Thomas's laughter chased him. Something else chased him. He reached the massive wooden chapel doors, his hands slamming against the handles. They gave way. Suddenly, he was outside. The cold night air slammed into him like a physical force. His lungs sucked in a deep, burning breath. The sky above was black, starless. The whispers, they stopped. The screams from inside the chapel fell silent. The stranger turned, his entire body shaking, his blood roaring in his ears. The chapel doors were shut, sealed. The sound of the world, gone. As if nothing had ever happened at all. His grip tightened on the gun. His breath came slow, uneven. He took a step forward and then, the doors creaked, a slow, aching sound, and a voice, soft as the wind. "You should not have let me wake." The chapel stood in silence, its massive wooden doors looming behind him like the gates of an unspoken horror. The stranger's breath was ragged, his chest heaving as he took in the unnatural stillness that had settled over the world. Nothing stirred. The wind had died. The sounds of the city beyond the wrought iron gates of the Whitmore estate had vanished. It was as if reality itself had folded in on this place, leaving him alone. And yet, he wasn't. He could still feel it. Whatever had crawled out of Thomas Whitmore's coffin, whatever had twisted its voice through the walls of the chapel, it was still watching. The air was thick, weighted with something unseen but undeniable. He had felt this kind of dread before, not in the face of men, not even in the presence of death, but in those fleeting moments when the universe seemed to whisper that some doors were never meant to be opened. And he had opened one. The dog whined beside him. The sound startled him out of his paralysis, and his gaze snapped downward to where the mutt had wedged itself behind the cold stone steps of the chapel. Its wiry frame trembled violently, ears pinned flat against its skull, but its eyes were still locked on the door. Still waiting. Still listening. The stranger turned his head slowly. His fingers flexed around the grip of his gun, though he knew now that it would do nothing against this. The doors of the chapel hadn't moved, hadn't opened, but they would. He knew that now. The thing inside, it wasn't finished with him yet. He forced himself to breathe. Think. The estate grounds stretched wide around him, swallowed in fog, the sprawling hedges and iron-wrought fences disappearing into the dense void beyond. A cobblestone path led from the chapel to the main road, flanked by towering cypress trees that swayed without wind. His car was somewhere beyond them, if he could make it that far. A sound. A soft, distant noise. Barely perceptible but unmistakable. A whisper. His pulse thundered in his ears as he turned his head, scanning the darkness, straining to hear. It came again. Not from the chapel, not from the doors, from the trees. A single elongated breath, exhaling. A shape shifted in the fog. A figure. Standing just at the edge of the cypress trees, its silhouette barely visible. Not moving, just watching. The stranger took an unconscious step backward. The dog let out a small, pitiful whine. He knew that figure hadn't been there before. Knew because he would have seen it. It hadn't walked there. It had been placed there. And it was waiting. The stranger clenched his jaw. He forced his hand to steady itself around his weapon, though he knew it was useless. "Who are you?" he called, his voice lower than he intended. The figure did not respond, did not move, did not breathe. The stranger's muscles coiled. He had spent a lifetime facing the unknown, a career forged in dark places, chasing truths people did not want found. But this This was different. This wasn't just something hidden. This was something that had been kept away for a reason. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, each second stretching into eternity. And then the figure tilted its head. Not much, just a fraction. Just enough to let him know. It had hurt him. The stranger took another slow step back. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but he forced himself to remain steady. Because he understood something now. If he ran, it would follow. Not like a man. Not like something chasing, but like something inevitable. Like fate. The dog whimpered again. A shadow passed over the stranger's vision. His breath hitched, his pulse stopped. The figure was closer. Not by much, just a step, just enough. Enough to let him know that whatever rules this thing followed, they were not his. The weight of its presence pressed against his skin, the air itself thick with the scent of something old, something that did not belong in this world. The fog curled around it, the darkness stretched toward it, and then it smiled. The stranger felt the bottom of his soul drop. It wasn't a normal smile. It wasn't even a twisted grin, something human warped into something grotesque. No, this was worse. It was the absence of a smile, a suggestion of something that had never known how to mimic joy. And then it took another step. The stranger's body snapped into motion. He turned on his heel, grabbing the dog by the scruff of its neck, yanking it forward. The mutt let out a startled yelp, but ran. He ran, boots hammering against cobblestone, breath tearing from his lungs. The fog thickened around him. The trees bent inward. The whispers rose. Somewhere in the distance, the chapel doors creaked open. And something laughed. The car was ahead, just a little farther. His feet slammed against the pavement, gravel kicking up beneath his boots as he sprinted, the cold night air burning his throat. The headlights of his car gleamed in the distance, the only beacon in the growing darkness. But he could feel it behind him. Not footsteps, not breath, just presence. Just inevitability. The dog yowled. He threw himself forward, slamming against the car door. His hands fumbled for the keys. Damn it, damn it, damn it. Click. The door yanked open. He threw himself inside, the dog scrambling in after him. His hands trembled as he jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. His hand slammed against the wheel, his foot slamming against the pedal. And then, the laughter stopped. The whispers vanished. The fog ceased. The silence was sudden, abrupt, wrong. His pulse pounded, his breath ragged. He turned his head. The chapel doors were shut. The trees were still. The road ahead was clear. It was as if nothing had ever happened. As if none of it was real. But he knew better. He knew it wasn't over. The dog curled against the passenger seat, its body still trembling. The stranger's hands tightened around the wheel. He didn't know what had just happened. Didn't know what he had just seen, but he knew one thing. Thomas Whitmore had never left that coffin alone. And whatever had come in his place, it wasn't finished with him yet. The road stretched before him, dark and empty. The car's headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the path ahead, but the stranger barely saw it. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his knuckles white, his breath shallow and uneven. The dog lay curled in the passenger seat, its trembling form pressed against the leather. Its breathing was rapid, shallow, mirroring his own. His mind was racing. What the hell had he just witnessed? Everything in his life, every case he had taken, every dark place he had walked into, had always led to a logical conclusion, a truth. But this was something else. The memory of Thomas Whitmore's eyes burned into his skull, those bottomless black pits. That voice, layered, fragmented, wrong. And the thing in the trees. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus. He needed to get out of this town, away from the Whitmore estate, away from whatever had come out of that coffin. His foot pressed harder against the gas pedal. The speedometer climbed, 40, 50, 60 miles per hour. The road wound through the countryside, lined with nothing but endless rows of skeletal trees, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky like black veins against the night. His pulse hammered in his ears. The world outside felt wrong. It wasn't just the chapel, wasn't just Thomas. Something had shifted. Something had woken up. His fingers twitched against the wheel. His instincts were screaming, a gut-deep certainty curling around his spine. He was still being watched. The thought sent ice through his veins. The road ahead stretched into oblivion. No streetlights, no signs, just an endless void of darkness. Then, the headlights flickered. For a single, terrible second, the world plunged into pitch black. The stranger's heart stopped. The lights flared back to life, and someone was standing in the middle of the road. A tall, thin figure. Still. Waiting. No face. Just a silhouette. The stranger's body reacted before his mind. He swerved hard. The tires screeched against the pavement. The car fishtailed violently, gravel and dirt spraying as he fought to regain control. The dog yelped. The stranger's pulse roared. He wrenched the wheel, forcing the car away from the figure. And then, silence. The road was empty. No figure. No one. His breath came in ragged gasps. He forced his hands to steady. What the hell was that? The figure had been right there. He had seen it. Tall, motionless, waiting. But now, the road ahead stretched undisturbed. He swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his temple. And then, the dog growled. A low, rumbling sound. The stranger's blood ran cold. Because the dog wasn't looking at the road. It was looking at the rearview mirror. Slowly, so painfully slowly, the stranger turned his head, and his stomach dropped. The figure was in the back seat, a shadow, barely there, just an outline in the darkness. Not moving, not breathing, waiting. The stranger reacted instinctively. He spun in his seat, gun raised. Nothing. The back seat was empty. The breath he had been holding collapsed from his chest. His fingers trembled around the gun, his pulse a relentless hammering against his ribs. The dog was still staring, still watching. The stranger swallowed thickly, gripping the wheel. His mind screamed at him to move. He pressed his foot against the gas. The car lurched forward, tearing down the road. But the road was wrong. His eyes flicked to the GPS on the dashboard. The map had been tracking his movement, marking the path back toward the highway. But now, the screen was blank. Just a single blinking message. Route unknown. A shiver ran through him. He knew these roads, knew where he had been driving, but the world outside him, it didn't look the same anymore. The trees stretched taller, the road seemed narrower, the darkness was thicker. He turned his eyes back to the windshield and slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, tires shrieking against the pavement, because the chapel was in front of him. Exactly as it had been before. The massive wooden doors, the towering spires, the funeral hall where Thomas Whitmore had woken up. He felt his stomach plummet. His hands were trembling. His breath hitched. No. He had been driving away. He had been miles from here. And yet, the Whitmore chapel was still in front of him. He hadn't moved, hadn't escaped. The car's engine rumbled beneath his hands. His heart was a hammer against his ribs. The dog was whining now. And then, a voice. Software low. Close. You cannot leave. The stranger's body locked. Because the voice hadn't come from the chapel. It hadn't come from outside. It had come from the back seat. Slowly. So painfully slowly. He turned his head. And this time, the figure was there. Not a shadow. Not an illusion. A presence. Sitting in the back seat, right behind him. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The figure leaned forward. And finally, in the dim glow of the dashboard, the stranger saw its face. His own. The thing in the back seat was him. His own face stared back at him, perfectly identical. The same sharp jawline, the same weary, haunted eyes. But something was wrong. The skin was too smooth. The eyes were too still. And the smile, it wasn't his. It stretched across its face with an unsettling ease, as if it had been carved there. as if it had been waiting a long time to be used. The stranger's throat was dry. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, his entire body locked in place. His pulse thundered behind his ears, drowning out everything except the sound of his own breathing. Except, it wasn't just his. The thing in the back seat was breathing too. Slow, even, patient. He forced himself to move. His fingers twitched toward his gun, but the other him, only tilted its head, amused. It wasn't just his. The thing in the back seat was breathing too. Slow, even, patient. He forced himself to move. His fingers twitched toward his gun, but the thing on the other him only tilted its head, amused, and then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was his, the exact same tone, the exact same rhythm, but it didn't belong to him. His stomach lurched. This was impossible. All of this was impossible. He had seen the dead wake, had heard the whispers crawl through the chapel walls, had stood face to face with something that should have never opened its eyes again. But this was something else. His own reflection was watching him, waiting. And then, it blinked. The motion was slow, deliberate, like the lazy movement of a predator who had already decided the outcome of the hunt. A breath of cold air ghosted over the back of the stranger's neck. His entire body seized. Because the thing behind him, it wasn't alone. He felt it now. A weight, a shift in the air, as if something else had just joined them in the car. The dog whimpered. The stranger's fingers flexed over the wheel. His other hand hovered near his gun. He had to act. Now his body moved before his mind could catch up. He spun in his seat, the gun snapping up. The back seat was empty. His breath caught. His head snapped forward. It was sitting in the passenger seat now, his own face, inches from his own voice. "Why are you running?" A fist of ice clenched in his chest. The thing wasn't moving like a man. It was slipping through space, shifting from one place to another like it had never been bound by human constraints at all. It smiled again. He fired. The gunshot exploded through the car, shattering the window, sending glass raining across the dashboard. The impact should have torn through its skull. But the bullet passed through empty air. And the thing laughed. Not a sound, not a noise, a void. The absence of sound, the empty space where laughter should have been, curling in on itself like a whispered secret. The dog screamed. The stranger barely had time to react before the thing moved again. It was gone. Just gone. The air in the car shifted, and then something grabbed his throat. An invisible force yanked him backward, his spine slammed against the driver's seat, his vision going white-hot with pain. His lungs seized, his breath strangled. He tried to fight, tried to move, but the grip was impossibly strong. And then, from behind him, from the darkness itself, the whisper returned, software close. "It's time to wake up." The world exploded. The White Room. When he opened his eyes, he was somewhere else. A vast emptiness stretched before him, an infinite white nothingness that had no ceiling, no walls, no end. It was like standing in the belly of a dream, or the place where dreams went to die. The stranger swallowed hard. His gun was gone. The car was gone. The dog. His head snapped around and relief slammed into his chest. The mutt was still there, pressed against his leg, its small body trembling. But everything else, it was gone. And then he heard the footsteps. Software unhurried, coming toward him from somewhere inside the endless white. His jaw clenched. He turned slowly. And there he was, standing across from him, his own reflection, the thing. But it wasn't grinning now. It wasn't even moving. It was just watching, studying, like it was waiting for him to speak first. His voice was hoarse when he finally did. "What are you?" The other him smiled, but it wasn't cruel anymore. It was almost sad. It lifted one hand, palm up, gesturing toward the infinite white around them. "This is where you were always going to end up." The stranger's stomach twisted. His mind screamed, No. This wasn't right. He had gotten away, had left the chapel, had driven for miles, hadn't he? The thing, his reflection, tilted its head. You never left? The stranger's heart stopped. A cold, sinking horror crawled through him. And then, as if hearing his thoughts, his reflection stepped forward and whispered something that made the world shatter. You died back there, in the chapel. You never left at all. The stranger's breath hitched, his entire body going rigid. He stared at his reflection, at the thing standing before him in the infinite white void, his mind desperately trying to reject its words. You died back there, in the chapel. You never left at all. No, that wasn't possible. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. He reached up, pressing trembling fingers against his own skin, his throat, his face, his chest, solid. He could feel himself. He could feel the air in his lungs, the ground beneath his feet. Dead men didn't feel. Dead men didn't breathe. The dog whimpered beside him, pressing its body against his leg as if trying to ground him in reality. But what was reality? Because the thing in front of him, the thing that wore his face, was smiling. Not cruelly, not mockingly, but softly. Like a parent watching a child who didn't understand the lesson they were about to learn. The stranger swallowed hard, forcing the words out. You're lying. The reflection tilted its head, like it had expected that. Am I? The words lingered, stretching through the void like ripples in still water. The stranger took a step back. The white emptiness around him did not change. He turned sharply, his instincts screaming, searching for an exit, a door, a road, something, nothing. Just endless, vast white stretching into nothingness. His stomach twisted. I got away, he said, his voice low, firm, as if saying it out loud would anchor it in truth. I left the chapel. I ran. I got in my car. His own voice faltered. A flicker of something wrong danced through his memories. Had he gotten away? Had he ever really driven those roads? Or had the chapel been waiting for him all along? The figure in front of him stepped forward. Not rushed, not aggressive, just moving, closing the distance between them with steady, patient steps. The stranger's fingers twitched at his side, but his gun was gone. The thing smiled again. What's the last thing you remember? The words were gentle, software like a whisper before sleep. The stranger's breath shook, his memories blurred. The chapel, the coffin, the way Thomas Whitmore had opened his eyes, the whispers, the thing in the trees, his own voice, speaking to him from the backseat of his car, and then the doors of the chapel had opened, and something had reached for him. A breath of ice pressed against his skin, the weight of invisible fingers curling around his throat. A voice, echoing in the dark. It's time to wake up. His pulse stuttered. His body went cold. Because suddenly, he wasn't sure if he had ever made it out of that chapel at all. The reflection watched him, waiting, giving him time. The stranger's throat tightened, his mind raced. If he was dead, if this was death, then what the hell was this place? The void, the endless white, the feeling of waiting. It wasn't nothingness. It wasn't eternal peace. It was something else, something unfinished. His fingers curled into fists. The reflection took another step closer. And then, it reached out its hand. A slow, open gesture. An offer. Not of violence, not of cruelty, but of understanding. A cold, suffocating dread wrapped around the stranger's ribs. His entire life had been about chasing the truth, peeling back the layers of a world that thrived on deception. But now he was the one who didn't want to see, didn't want to know. Because if he reached out, if he took that hand, it would mean accepting the truth, the final truth. And he wasn't ready, not yet. The reflection's fingers hovered, waiting, patient. But something deep and primal inside the stranger screamed at him to run. He spun on his heel and ran. His boots pounded against the nothingness beneath him. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to move. The white void stretched endlessly in all directions. There was no ground, no sky, no walls. But somehow, the sensation of running still existed. And behind him, he could feel it, the presence. Not chasing, just waiting, watching, letting him tire himself out. The dog barked, its paws scrambling against the same non-existent floor. It didn't understand either. There was nowhere to go, because the truth, the one thing he had spent his entire life chasing, was already inside him. He was dead. He had never left the chapel. And now something was keeping him here. His steps slowed. His breath was sharp, ragged. The weight of the void pressed down on him, suffocating, final. He turned. The reflection was still standing there, exactly where it had been before. Watching. Waiting. It hadn't needed to follow, because it had always been ahead of him. The stranger's legs gave out. His knees hit the ground, except there was no ground. Just an endless abyss of white. His breath shook. The dog curled against his side. And finally, with the weight of inevitability settling over his shoulders, the stranger lifted his gaze and asked the question he had been avoiding. "Why am I still here?" The reflection's expression softened. And then it said the last thing he ever expected. "Because you don't want to go. Because you don't want to go." The words hung in the infinite white void, sinking into the silence like stones into deep water. The stranger stared at his reflection. His mind rebelled against it, clawing for another answer, another truth, anything but this. But the thing wearing his face only watched. Patient. Knowing. The dog pressed against his side, its body trembling. His chest tightened, because deep down he knew. He had spent his entire life chasing the truth, hunting it down, digging into places no one else dared. And now, at the very end, he was running from it. His fingers curled against his knees. His breath came slow, uneven. "What are you?" he whispered. The reflection did not answer. Instead, it crouched down before him, mirroring his position exactly. The same tired eyes, the same unshaven jaw, the same weight pressing against his shoulders, and then softly, "I am you." A shudder ran through the stranger's body. "No," he rasped. His pulse hammered. "No, that's not—" But the reflection only watched. And in its gaze, he saw it. Everything. The night Thomas Whitmore had died. The moment his coffin had been lowered into the ground, the whispers in the dark, the way the earth had never settled over his grave. The night of the funeral, the way the dog had known before anyone else, the way the air had thickened inside the chapel, the way Thomas had opened his eyes, and then, the moment the doors had slammed shut, the moment something had reached for him, the moment he had felt his own breath stop, his own heart fail, his own body falling into nothingness. He had never left, never made it to his car, never driven down those roads. Everything, the escape, the highway, the figure in the back seat, had all been part of the illusion, because his mind had refused to understand what his body already knew. He had died, in the chapel, with them. His throat tightened. A part of him wanted to scream, to deny it, to fight. But what was there to fight? His reflection, his truth, was still waiting, still offering its hand, not as a monster, not as a demon, but as himself. The stranger swallowed. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Then why am I still here?" The reflection's fingers flexed slightly. "Because you don't want to leave." The stranger froze, his pulse stilled. "You're holding on." The words burrowed into him, cutting deeper than any wound. He thought of his life, the things he had lost, the cases he had never closed, the regrets that had followed him like shadows no matter how far he had run. He had spent his entire life chasing answers, digging up the things no one else wanted to see. And yet, at the end of it all, he had never found his own peace. That was why he was still here. That was why he had never left that chapel, because some part of him, some twisted, grieving part of him, was still fighting to understand, still trying to solve the puzzle. But this was a puzzle that had no answer, no solution, only an ending. And he hadn't been ready for that. Not yet. His breath came slow, shaky. The dog nudged his arm. He looked down. The mutt's dark eyes were filled with something raw, something almost pleading. It wanted him to understand, to let go. His fingers twitched. His reflection's hand was still waiting. He hesitated. Then, after a long moment, he reached out. The moment their fingers touched, the world tilted. The white void shattered, and the stranger fell. The chapel. He opened his eyes back where it had all begun. The funeral hall. The coffin. The candles were still burning, the air still thick with the scent of incense. The whispers were gone, and Thomas Whitmore's body lay inside the coffin, lifeless once more. A weight settled over the stranger's chest. The doors of the chapel were open. The dog sat beside him, watching him carefully. A deep, bone-heavy exhaustion settled into his limbs. His breath shook. This time when he stood, he knew it was over. He turned one last time to look at the coffin. Then he stepped outside. Into the night. Into whatever came next. The dog followed. And behind them. The chapel doors closed. For good. The stranger never escaped the chapel because he wasn't meant to. He had to accept what was already true. What about you? What would you do if the past refused to let you go?